The holiday season officially starts when you get that first card in the mail. Shutterfly makes it easy to add more meaning to the everyday with hundreds of holiday card designs that can be personalized in seconds with your favorite photos from this year. Select your greeting, customize the color, and even add little extras like personalized foil to make a holiday card that really shines. Enjoy 40% off with code SMILE40 at Shutterfly.com and send something meaningful this year. See site for more details.
Wishing for a body wash made with natural ingredients? Dr. Squatch has got you covered. Manly scents that make you irresistible, a thick lather that leaves your skin moisturized all day. No matter what you're looking for in a body wash, rest assured, Dr. Squatch is your best bet. Pick up one today in store or at drsquatch.com. It's Dr. Squatch Body Wash for men who prefer natural.
This episode is brought to you by Netflix. From the co-director of Shrek and the visionary behind Toy Story comes Spellbound, a magical new animated adventure starring Rachel Zegler, John Lithgow, Jennifer Lewis, Nathan Lane, and Titus Burgess with Javier Bardem and Nicole Kidman. When a powerful spell turns her parents into monsters, Princess Elian must journey into the wild to reverse the curse before it's too late. Watch Spellbound, only on Netflix November 22nd.
We want to warn you that this podcast contains disturbing content. It's June 1991. Jaycee Dugard is located about 150 miles southwest of South Lake Tahoe on a street called Walnut Avenue in the town of Antioch. There stands a fairly unremarkable, medium-sized white house, but it has a very large backyard that's hard to see from the road. The back part of the yard is screened off by a hedge and a tall fence. In that backyard, in a shed, lives Jaycee Dugard.
She's restrained into this steel shed, basically.
About a week after she arrives at Walnut Avenue, her kidnapper, the man we know as Philip Garrido, a convicted sex offender, comes out to her in the shed.
Comes in with the milkshake, and I was getting used to him coming in. But he said things were going to be different.
He turns on a tape player with his own music and then forces her down onto the mattress on the floor, saying this is God's will. And then he rapes her mercilessly.
I remember crying, but they were silent. Just tears running down my face.
Afterwards, Philip Garrido starts crying. He says she must do this to help him, so that he won't do this to other girls, that this makes him get better. I'm a bad person, but you can cure me. For 11-year-old Jaycee, the experience is confusing and frightening.
Here I am trying to, feeling, hurting, because it hurt, wanting it to stop. And I have to comfort him.
And during the first 18 months in Philip and Nancy Garrido's custody, Jaycee is not even allowed to leave the secluded backyard, hidden behind trees and fences. Not even once.
Only out to, have a bath, shower, and to be hosed down and then put back in there. He repeatedly rapes her,
You're listening to Girl Missing, a podcast series about the kidnapping of 11-year-old Jaycee Dugard and the terrible consequences a failed justice system can have. My name is Jonathan Rollins, and if you like this podcast, go follow Crime by PodLit, where you'll find our other series and can see when new episodes are released. This is Chapter 4, A Prison Within a Prison. So where has Jaycee Dugard ended up? Well, as we said, in a backyard behind a house on Walnut Avenue in Antioch, California. Antioch is located just over 70 kilometers east of San Francisco and is what's called an unincorporated area. That is, a place that doesn't belong to any municipality and therefore has no municipal governance or municipal institutions like schools or police stations. Such a place is Antioch. We hear from author John Glatt, who has written a book about the kidnapping of Jaycee Dugard.
Well, Antioch is very much like the Wild West. It's an unincorporated part of California. There's very few policemen there, whatever. And it's like as I said, it's like the Wild West. There's a lot of methamphetamine there and drugs, and a lot of sex offenders, in fact, go to Antioch because there's no schools around. So you got the worst of the worst. It was, quite an impoverished place, and you got away with a lot more there than you would have done in a real town,
And this is what it sounds like in the YouTube channel Living San Francisco Bay Area.
And today we are going to be talking about the worst cities to live in the Bay Area according to crime data and school data. Antioch. Antioch, California is the third largest city in Contra Costa. It's out past Walnut Creek, neighboring Concord. It gets very, very, very hot, and it ranks as one of the most dangerous cities in California. Antioch ranks 678 per 100,000 for total crime report, with 49 rapes, 8 homicides, and 261 robberies.
And even though this is about today, the video's from 2024, Antioch has long been a place for the more shady residents of our society. In 2009, Rainey Robinson, who runs a company that helps criminals pay bail, is interviewed by Channel 4, and she has a good idea of how many sex offenders live in Antioch.
We have a lot. It's a small community, and I think people would be surprised to know exactly how many are on the list, where they are, and living right next door to them.
Rainey's husband, David, with whom she runs 8th Amendment bail bonds, is also interviewed.
In Antioch alone, we do have 123 sex offenders on the list. You can pick any house in Antioch, and I guarantee there's one within a mile of you.
Yes, 103 of them. And the city only has a population of about 100,000. And just as we heard in the clip from YouTube earlier, it gets very hot in the summer. And on that small street, Walnut Avenue, there aren't many houses. Most are quite run-down wooden houses or trailers. There are no sidewalks, and the road is poorly maintained. 1554 is an ordinary house, like the others. From the front, it doesn't stand out at all. That's where Philip Garrido lives with his wife Nancy and his mother Pat Franzen. But in the garden, at the back of the house, which you can't see from the road, that's different.
For a few months prior, Philip Garrido had been setting up basically a prison within a prison in his garden. He'd erected an 8-foot fence around it so nobody could see what was going on, and he planted all these trees and shrubbery and everything. So you thought the garden kind of ended at one point, but there was a whole back area which nobody could see, and that was what he'd arranged to be the prison.
Yes, Philip Garrido had planted trees to divide the front part of the yard from the back. Tall trees that were impossible to see through. And if you looked just quickly, you would think the yard ended there, that it was just empty land behind it. But instead, he had created, as author John Glatt says, a prison within a prison.
Well, he'd had his whole compound in his back of the back garden, which nobody could see, in fact. It was totally hidden by this, 8-foot fence all the way around. There were at least half a dozen different sheds and tents and things like that, And he'd also equipped it for electricity. There were electric cables going to the various ones, that fed it, basically. So it was a compound within a compound, basically.
And in this prison within a prison, 11-year-old Jaycee is forced to live in a tiny shed, maybe 10 square meters.
There were no windows on it or anything. There was no way of knowing the time of day or anything like that. And then every so often he would turn up to lead her out to use the bathroom, and he had like a hose to shower her down outside. She was fed 2 or 3 times a day by him and Nancy, and that poor girl must have been absolutely terrified, you know?
When John Glatt talks about the bathroom, it's a bit of a stretch because it wasn't a real bathroom. It was an outhouse and an outdoor shower with a makeshift water system. And this is where Jaycee would stay for 18 months without ever leaving this hidden part of Philip Garrido's yard. She was only allowed to see Philip and Nancy, no one else. And here, we might need to pause a little because it may seem strange that Philip's wife Nancy would go along with kidnapping an 11-year-old girl. She wasn't a convicted criminal before, but she went along with it.
Nancy helped kidnap, she tasered Jaycee, and she would aid and abet the rapes, which happened every day, I think.
Yes, Nancy was complicit in everything. She even helped during the rapes. And later, they found videos at Philip and Nancy's home.
Okay, now see the zoom lens? Oh, you can zoom in?
Oh, no, shit. Where, did you push that?
Yeah. Is it gone far enough?
No.
Okay, that's as far. Is it still moving?
In the video,
no,
Nancy pretends to film Philip while he sings a song.
So what you need to do you need to make it look like you're pointing at me. I was getting funny, but you need to move over more in front of me.
But instead of filming Philip, Nancy films young girls playing and swinging at a playground in the background.
Set yourself back about right there.
Okay.
Got me real good?
Yes. I can see you really good.
She was all in on it,
Nancy often brought food to Jaycee, and after Philip raped her, Nancy would bring small gifts. Jaycee was given a tiny TV, although the only thing she was allowed to watch was QVC, a home shopping channel, as she told Diane Sawyer on ABC News.
Yeah, I would fall asleep to the sound of jewelry being sold. But at least it was talking.
At first, Jaycee was sad and cried. She prayed to God to be able to go home. But as time passed, her attitude changed, and she became more and more focused on being compliant, not making Philip angry.
I'll do it better. I'll be good. Because it was the unknown that was terrifying.
As horrible as the life she now lived was, the unknown was even scarier. But it was also about Philip Garrido, who, as we've heard, had charmed women, police officers, and prison guards before. He was now working on Jaycee Lee Dugard.
He uses his mind control, basically, And at one point, I think he brings in a cat. He says, look, I bought this cat. It cost me $200, but it's just for you. And things start to go in her mind. She sees him as maybe his savior, and it's textbook Stockholm syndrome,
Yes, according to John Glatt, you could almost call this Stockholm syndrome, when someone starts to feel affection for their captor.
Stockholm syndrome comes from, there was these gunmen held up people in a bank. Eventually, they came onto the captor's side, and they saw things the other way, and they didn't want to press charges against them or anything afterwards, So it's like a mental control, basically. And Garrido was very, very good at it.
The term comes from an incident in Stockholm, Sweden, about 50 years ago, where some bank robbers held staff and visitors hostage for 6 days. The hostages, both during and after the event, expressed sympathy for the robbers rather than the police. The term has been criticized, and maybe it's just that Garrido, as we've heard, was a skilled manipulator. And as Jaycee herself mentioned earlier, after a while, the outside world, the unknown, became scarier than the terrible reality that she knew. Being locked up in a backyard, living in a small, soundproof shed.
And basically, I mean, her life and death were in his hands. And I mean, the one thing about Jaycee, she was kind of timid, and she didn't fight back. And the sort of people think that if she had put up a fight and made things hard, she might not have got out of there alive. So it was very lucky that she just kind of, gave in to what had to be done in order to live,
I was so lonely. I felt so alone.
Philip Garrido did something else to further tie Jaycee to him and distance her from her family, her past, and her identity, who she really was.
He renames her Alyssa, Alyssa, and gives her his mother's name, Franson, and totally tries to, rob her of her real identity. And they call her Alyssa. That's her new name, But from her diary she keeps, she always knows that she's really Jaycee, and she has parents, and she has a sister, so she keeps that in her head.
We will return to that diary, which Jaycee, or Alyssa as she was now called, kept in a secret spot in her shed. She never showed it to Philip or Nancy, but now she played along, doing as they said. She accepted the rapes, which continued night after night.
I don't know if you ever get used to that, but you can get used to things. Once I got used to that, it would be the unknown thing that was more terrifying than actually keeping with the runs and doing something that was, at least I knew what was going to happen.
This episode is brought to you by Etsy.
Oh.
Hear that?
Okay. Thank you.
Etsy knows these aren't the sounds of holiday gifting. Well, not the ones you're hoping for. You want squeals of delight. Happy tears.
How did you?
And spontaneously written songs of joy.
I am so happy. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah.
Okay, the song needs a bit of work, but anyway, to get those reactions, make sure everyone on your list feels heard with handmade, handpicked, and designed gifts from small shops on Etsy. Gifts like personalized jewelry, custom artwork, cozy style items, vintage pieces, and home decor to celebrate all of your favorite people and their specific kind of special. For original gifts that say, I get you, Etsy has it.
And eventually, after 18 months, he would let her out of the 10-foot by 10-foot steel shed out there to walk around, and eventually, she could move into one of the tents. So little by little, he gave her these small bits of freedom in increments, which made her beholden to him. So I think that's what, he was trying to brainwash her in that way.
Back in South Lake Tahoe, Terry Probin continued to hope. On the anniversary of the kidnapping, more than 400 people gathered for a candlelight vigil. Both Terry, Carl, and their young daughter Shayna attended the ceremony, and Terry expressed her continued hope.
She is coming home. That gives me a lot of hope, a lot of optimism. Somebody's, feeding me dreams for a reason.
In an interview with Geraldo Rivera, Terry emphasized how important it was for her and Carl to stay strong together.
When Jaycee comes home, she's going to need that family life. She can't afford for us to be split up.
Jaycee's aunt, Terry's sister, who was very close to them, told the OC Register that, in the beginning, she never lost hope.
The first day, I kept thinking, tomorrow. They'll find her tomorrow. And then it was, for sure by the weekend. They'll find her for sure by the weekend. Then it was, by Thanksgiving, I know it won't pass. Then it became, for sure, Christmas. In fact, I did get it out. Over on the counter over there is the Barbie that I bought for her that Christmas. And so that was the year the Barbies came out, the special Barbies.
But when Terry and Carl were interviewed about a year after the kidnapping by a Sacramento television station, Both of them looked tired and worn out. It seemed like they had aged much more than a year since Jaycee disappeared.
We are living our worst nightmare. Unfortunately, it's gone on for too long.
At the same time, neither the family nor the rest of South Lake Tahoe had forgotten or given up. Singer Terry Dugard recorded a song about Jaycee, which was sent out to radio stations all across Nevada to raise awareness that Jaycee was still missing.
Whenever I sing it, sometimes it's hard to get through it. It really is, because it's a very sad situation.
Here, Terry Dugard and Jaycee's mother, Terry Probin, are interviewed by KRON-4.
I want Jaycee to hear it, and I want the abductors that took Jaycee to hear it and know that she's in everybody's heart.
Jaycee, Jaycee Lee.
But for Jaycee, or Alyssa as she was now called, hearing the song was not only unlikely, but completely impossible. Alyssa was still only allowed to watch QVC on her little TV, and she was still never allowed to leave the backyard on Walnut Avenue in Antioch. In May of 1993, Alyssa turned 13 years old. She had lived in the shed in the backyard for 24 months. And for her 13th birthday, she got that kitten that John Glatt mentioned earlier. In her diary, Alyssa wrote, "Philip and Nancy did something no one else would do for me. They spent $200 so I could have my own kitten." But soon, Alyssa would have something else to think about besides the kitten.
She suddenly becomes pregnant with his baby, and that really changes everything. I mean, Philip and Nancy are going to have a child through her.
Yes. At the age of just 13, Alyssa becomes pregnant. And this has actually been part of Philip Garrido's evil plan all along. Nancy cannot have children, and now she would get to be a mother, and he will become a father to a little baby.
Nancy, in fact, is a trained nurse, so she's looking after Alyssa, as she's called then, and trying to make her as comfortable as possible.
Alyssa is, of course, not allowed to see a midwife or have any checkups during her pregnancy, as would normally be the case. But since Nancy is a trained nurse, she is able to provide some support and help during the 9 months Alyssa carries her child. However, when it comes time for her to give birth, she is completely alone in her shed.
I can't fathom how I kept it together, or, I must have been checked out, on a different level, present but not present for, some of it, because it's terrifying on its own, but being alone, how did I even do that?
With no drugs or anything, this is in a tent she gives birth, and Philip Garrido names the child Angel.
But when the baby, her daughter Angel, is lying there on Alyssa's chest for the first time in 2 years, she feels something that just might resemble happiness.
She was beautiful. I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. Had somebody that was mine. I wasn't alone. And I knew I could never let anything happen to her. I didn't know how I was going to do that, but I did.
And immediately after the birth, Philip also stops raping Alyssa, for a while at least. Then he comes up with the idea that he will take Alyssa as his second wife.
He brings Nancy in the garden and performs a wedding ceremony with him and Alyssa, saying they're married. So now he has Nancy and Alyssa as wives, which is bizarre. But he actually performs this ceremony, in the garden with his music and everything. And it's horrific.
But when it comes to Alyssa's life, not much changes when she becomes a mother. She continues living in the shed with an outhouse in the yard.
The smell must have been atrocious, really horrible. She's never gone to a dentist. They can't go out to go to a dentist or a doctor. So, it's really foul out there, I would imagine, especially when you have a little kid. That's not the best way for a baby to grow up in that situation. And of course, while this is going on, Philip and Nancy are living comfortably in their house, clean and everything. So, it's horrible. They're living like animals, Alyssa and Angel. It's horrific.
Still, neither Alyssa nor Angel are allowed inside the house where Philip, Nancy, and Philip's mother Pat live. But when Angel turns 2, 4 long years after Alyssa was kidnapped and forced to live in the shed on Walnut Avenue, she's finally allowed to leave her prison within a prison. Not outside in the real sense, but at least into the house to clean for Philip and Nancy every now and then. And Philip has a reason for giving Alyssa a little more freedom. He has realized that Alyssa has a strong artistic talent, just like her mother, who you might remember worked as a graphic designer. Now, Philip decides to start a small printing business in one of his many sheds and tents in the backyard.
Called Print for Less.
The small business, Print for Less, was set up to make brochures, business cards, and such.
Alyssa would design various business cards, stationery, and maybe posters, things like that. And Philip Garrido would take them round to the various businesses, around there. And they became his customers, and they were very impressed with the work he did, He's charging far less than anyone else would do for business cards and whatever. So a lot of people go for this to save money.
Print for Less was a fitting name, and it certainly reflected reality. Since Alyssa was working for free, and the facilities, if you can call it that, the tents in the backyard, basically, were free as well, Print for Less was indeed very, very cheap.
And initially, it ran really well.
He seemed to be a little eccentric sometime. And
This is Jim Molino, one of the customers who bought business cards and other products from Print for Less.
But he always seemed to be doing good things.
Print for Less quickly became a successful small business with many customers around Antioch.
I spoke to 2 or 3 of them, and they all said that he was on time, he did good work at the beginning, and he charged less than anyone else, so they liked that.
People were satisfied, business was going well, and eventually, Philip could afford to buy a computer for his business.
And Alyssa must have been very smart. She taught herself how to use computers and do all this stuff, so she was a very smart girl. She must have enjoyed doing it. Rather than being, contained 24 hours a day in this, horrible prison, she was now out in an open air, in a shed, working and doing something to occupy her mind. So that was something she probably enjoyed, She now has a daughter, that she loves and she's helping to bring up. She has this strange family with Nancy and Philip, and she feels like a sense of well-being now,
Yes, perhaps it's some kind of strange well-being that sets in here in the mid-90s. And in 1997, Alyssa becomes pregnant again after more years of rape. And when she's 17 and a half, in November 1997, she gives birth to her second child.
And this time they name her Starlet, so there's the family.
Now Philip Garrido has 2 small daughters, and he's building more tents in the yard. He gets swings, a small plastic pool, and a slide. And this is his life now. The life of the 2 little girls and Alyssa's life. Trapped in a prison, within a prison, with no idea what's happening on the outside, and no clue that 3 hours away, Terry is still missing her daughter so much that she can barely live.
A piece of me is missing, definitely, a piece of my heart. I feel like it's been ripped, and I don't
feel like a complete person all the time because she's not here to fulfill that. This is Jaycee's room.
In the film Stolen Lives, a project aimed at raising awareness and finding missing children, Terry Probin shows Jaycee's room 4 years after the kidnapping. It has barely been touched since the day Jaycee disappeared.
Pretty much the way it was. I've added a few things, some of her things that she had stuffed in the drawer that I thought needed to be brought out. And I definitely like to be in here. Brings back memories, good memories of all the good times that we had. And then that puts me close to Jace.
But you can see in Terry that the years have taken a toll on her.
On the kidnapping date, on Jaycee's birthday date, my wife would take her vacation. She used to sit home for a week each one of those dates and cry, and she was a basket case.
Yes, every Christmas, every birthday, every anniversary of the kidnapping, Terry locks herself in her room, takes a week off, and just cries.
And once you've been damaged that deep, it broke my marriage up.
Eventually, the stress and grief become too much for the once happy couple. But there's one more thing that tears them apart, as Carl Probin tells AP.
I mean, it's like I've gone through hell. I'm a suspect.
Yes, because early in the investigation of Jaycee's disappearance, Carl becomes the prime suspect.
I'm the stepdad. I'm not, I know that. I'm the last person to see her.
In the documentary, Captive for 18 Years, Deputy Sheriff Jim Watson is interviewed.
You can't rule out anyone that knew or was involved with Jaycee, and you have to look at stepfathers.
No. In the majority of cases where children disappear, someone who knows them is involved. And the fact that Carl was the last person to see Jaycee, to witness what happened, doesn't help his case. And it's not just the police who suspect him. Parts of Terry's family believe Carl is behind it, as author John Glatt explains.
Some of Jaycee's family hired private detectives to investigate him, which he was well aware about. It must have really, really hurt him, because he was always under suspicion.
And the years after Jaycee's kidnapping become hell for Carl Probin.
I did lie detector tests. I had to write my life history down. I was questioned intensively, people thinking, this stepdad, he was mean to her, he made her have manners, he did this. And like I tell people, the stuff I've gone through, it's like I would have to be a genius. I've never been a day in my life in jail. My last speeding ticket was 1977. So I've, been pretty straight down the road,
Yes, despite Carl never having been to jail, or even receiving a speeding ticket since 1977, he's repeatedly subjected to lie detector test after lie detector test.
And I remember they asked me questions like, did you ever wish he wasn't around? Did you ever forge a document? And I'm thinking, why don't you guys ask me a straight question? And he says, well, we think you're holding something back. Would you take another one tomorrow? I said, sure. So then I took another one tomorrow, next day. And basically the same kind of questions.
We hear from Deputy Sheriff Jim Watson again.
Oh, I'm sure it was painful, but I don't have any regrets for what we did on the investigation. The person I was working for was Jaycee, and if it meant questioning the stepfather, Carl, it was simply to try to find out where Jaycee was at.
No, a police officer obviously can't avoid questioning someone just because it's tough on them. As Jim Watson says, he was working for Jaycee Lee Dugard, not anyone else. But it would turn out that Jim Watson and his colleagues were completely wrong, and that while they were thorough with Carl Probin year after year, they were far from diligent when it came to monitoring and controlling the sex offender and drug addict Philip Garrido. Quite the opposite.
Whoever knows about this, I want them all. Or turn my life upside down.
And eventually it would break up the marriage, when they split up. And he moved away, and, Terry stayed in South Lake Tahoe. But she was basically a basket case, and not knowing was the real, the real horrible thing about it,
Carl and Terry remained friends and never filed for divorce, but Carl moved out and got his own house. After a year or so, Terry moved away from South Lake Tahoe, which had become a place associated only with tragedy, to live closer to her sister, Tina, in Southern California.
I think she always dreamed that Jaycee was there, and every year on the anniversary of the kidnapping, Terry would lead marches with a lot of, hundreds of people behind her across the kidnap path. So they kept things alive from there. But, as time went on, the police hunt wound down, and basically it was kind of, they all but forgotten, it was, Jaycee had just kind of disappeared.
Yes, by the late 90s, not many believed that Jaycee would be found alive. Not even her mother, Terry, who had always kept hope alive for so long, unaware that her daughter was indeed alive and not so far away. For in Antioch, Philip Garrido continued running his printing business, where Alyssa worked designing brochures and business cards for small local companies. Since Philip was a convicted criminal and only on parole, he had to regularly report to a parole officer who was supposed to ensure that he behaved. He had to report to 2 different officers, one for his sentence in Nevada and one for his federal sentence. You may remember that Philip Garrido crossed the Nevada-California border with Katie Calloway, making it a federal crime. Over the years, Philip, in his typical charming way, managed to wrap parole officer after parole officer around his finger, something that would lead to dire consequences later on. But this charm made everyone think he was doing well. He had his business, which was profitable since he didn't pay any wages and had almost no overhead, and he lived in the house with his wife and elderly mother. Surely he wasn't causing any trouble, thought the various parole officers. So in March of 1999, it was decided that he would be released from federal parole and no longer needed to report to an officer in California. The decision read that he was released from parole early due to good behavior, and after a thorough review of your case, the commission has decided to discharge you from federal parole early. You are offered this due to your positive response to supervision and the personal progress you have made. The commission trusts that you will continue to be a productive citizen and obey society's laws. But this only applied to his federal parole.
But now he has Reno, Nevada parole, and there's some kind of exchange system because he's living in California where they do some deal for California to take over his parole from Nevada, and that's where things really fall through the cracks.
So, Philip was still on parole in Nevada, but since he lived in California, it would now be California parole officers handling this case. But it seems the communication wasn't entirely clear. Since 1997, after the introduction of Megan's Law, registered sex offenders were required to report to the police at least once a year to register and provide information on their residence. It also became illegal for convicted sex offenders to live within a certain distance of schools and preschools, although this wasn't an issue in the remote area of Antioch. So when his parole became California's responsibility, they were well aware that he was a sex offender, but they also believed he was, quote, a productive citizen who obeys society's laws, unquote. Besides, Philip was difficult to supervise.
He's known as quite difficult, so you get people didn't want to be his parole officer. Somebody else would take over, and they just kind of they just shrugged and didn't ask too many questions, and Garrido made the most of it. He was out delivering printing stuff to customers. He would always say he couldn't provide urine, he would have to go back later. So he just made things kind of difficult for them, you know.
Yes, parole officers didn't want to supervise him, not because he was unpleasant, But because he was slippery, he was never home, or he couldn't provide a urine sample at the time. Again and again, California tried to get Nevada to release Philip from parole, probably because California parole officers had to do the work. But Nevada stood firm. Philip Garrido had to continue being supervised. But, as you already know, that supervision was not much to speak of. Quite the opposite. And it would only get worse over the years. In the next episode, Philip Garrido slips through the cracks again and again.
And parole officers would go regularly to visit Philip. And in fact, one of them, did go into the backyard and made drawings of the actual compound and everything, but was never, suspicious enough to do anything else further except put it in his report.
Until a female officer sees something that makes her react.
I'm a mother. I have 2 young sons, and this is when my police mode turned into my mother mode, and I think the 2 really played key here with police intuition and mother's intuition. Something's up with those girls. Something's going on with those girls. We don't know what. We don't know what kind of activity's happening at home. I've got no proof. As a cop, you need proof to act. I was very frustrated.
You've just listened to the second chapter of Girl Missing, a series about the kidnapping of Jaycee Lee Dugard. This series is produced by Tove Freeman Leffler. Sound design and mixing by Jens Nielsen and Thomas Rajnai, who are also executive producers. My name is Jonathan Rollins. And don't forget to follow Crime by PodLit so you know when the next episode is released. And of course, all the other series we've done. Thank you for listening.